Pugh. That'll do it! That will do it! Pugh for Bournemouth! The roof of the Gold Sands is raised! Everyone here knows what that could mean to this football.
Hello, Cherries fans. Hope you're doing well today. Last night, it was finally revealed that Scott Parker has joined AFC Bournemouth, bringing his backroom staff with him. Jeff's with me. Jeff, how you doing?
Really good. Thank you, Sam. Really good.
Excellent. Well, on afcb.co.uk, the first interview is out, as well as a gallery and an access all areas video. Do advise you to check that out, and some press shots too. And before we bring in our guest today, are you impressed with what you've seen and heard, Jeff?
Yeah, so far so good. I mean, finally it's happened, and it does feel like it's been a long time coming. That's good. Scott Parker talks well. He talks a good game, and I would urge every fan to watch that video. You get a sense of what the guy's like, what his coaching is going to be like, the impact that he hopes to have on the team, and the sort of football that he's going to bring to the club, which all sound quite positive.
Very much so. And fair play to the club for doing all they've done. It was a very, very quick turnaround given the news. I suspect that a number of things were ironed out beforehand. But anyway, let's bring in our guest. And it's a certain journalist who's got experience of covering both clubs. He focused on Bournemouth in the 2019-20 season, transferred to Fulham in 2021. It's relegation Rutzler. It's Peter Rutzler from The Athletic. Peter, how are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks, Sam. Thanks for having me back. I thought I'd be some kind of pariah by now after jumping ship, so it's good to be back.
Is there any chance you can cover maybe Watford or Saints next season at all?
I had so many requests, and obviously covering Fulham, immediate requests were put in for Brentford after they went down. But no, all requests have been turned down. I'm staying on Fulham, so I will be down in the second tier next year. So I'm very excited.
Brilliant. Well,
you've got a question there, Sam, haven't we, in terms of Parker's ability to hold on to the quality journalist, and he can't do it.
Well, he obviously can't. And you know what? And you've had plenty of to write about in The Athletic. 2 seasons, 2 relegations, and a fly on the wall perspective at both clubs. And it's all on The Athletic to see. Do check that out. But yeah, interesting couple of years, Peter.
Yeah, no, definitely. 2 very different relegation seasons. 2 clubs, I think, that are similar in terms of stature and background to an extent. But then, going into both seasons, different things coming to play, obviously, with the end of Eddie Howe's tenure and how that sort of unraveled when you're thinking about a 5-year stay and the changes that needed to be made as the squad tried to adapt. And with Fulham, it's a completely different story, really. It's about trying to get into the Premier League and stay there and keep a squad that's stable. Something that Scott Parker wasn't able to do last year, but he's not the first to have tried and failed under the ownership of the Khan family.
Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, interesting. You talk about that. I mean, what do you think, based on what we've seen from football fans, mostly Fulham fans, about Parker and his style of play? I mean, they talk about it being quite drab, dull, and slow paced. Do you think they're genuine in those concerns, or are they just being a bit salty at his departure?
I mean, the nature of the departure, I don't think has gone down particularly well, as you can imagine. No, I wouldn't say it's saltiness. I think there is merit to those comments. It's very interesting because I think when Fulham went up via the playoffs under Parker, the way they played was quite a slow-paced game, very possession-based, would dominate matches. They wouldn't blow teams away. They weren't particularly thrilling, but they were very good at getting ahead in matches and then seeing the games out. They were very reliant on Alexander Mitrovic, who's a very specific type of player, very much a target man, and you want to play to his strengths, and he's so effective, especially at that level. And then I think in the Premier League, I think there was a sense of, okay, well, this is a very solid style of play that could really work in the top flight. But it actually changed. Scott Parker was, I felt in particular, was very, very pragmatic, played a very fluid and dynamic style. This meant jettisoning Mitrovic. He played a limited role, really. And Fulham's big problem was goals. So in terms of improving on that sense of, we're not really blowing teams away, for the financial strength and the strength of the squad too that Fulham possessed, it was quite surprising. But what I would say is last season, considering the amount of players that came in, a lot of them were loanees. They did buy into what Scott Parker was trying to do, and they were playing catch up. They had a slow start. I think the shortest turnaround there's ever been in the Premier League from the playoff final to the top flight. Players came in on deadline day, so I think the first 5-6 games didn't pick up any wins. So they were really playing catch up for much of the season. And Fulham did become more fluid, and they did play, I think, some very good possession-based football, some very, very much front foot football. But then at the same time, there were a lot of games where things became very, very stagnant. There were a lot of 0-0s. There were a lot of home games too, especially towards the back end of the season, because that's where, in that last run of games where Fulham didn't win any of the last 8, when they went to Anfield and won, and it was said, okay, Fulham are actually going to catch Newcastle here. They're going to pull themselves clear, but that didn't happen. I think that's very much will taint the memory of a season that had highs and lows. I think the big question for me now at Bournemouth is what Parker's team will look like with a squad that he can shape, and whether this is a squad that perhaps better suits him. He seemed to want to play this sort of more fluid, counter-attacking style in the Premier League. I think Bournemouth have some of the players for that. I think that could work quite well. But then at the same time, whether now that he doesn't have Mitrovic, and whether that means they can be that more dynamic team, whether that changes things too. Because I don't know if we've actually seen what a true Scott Parker team actually looks like. Recruitment at Fulham is overseen by the owner's son and Tony Khan, who's also the director of football. So, I mean, Parker has a say, but it's his domain. So it'd be interesting to see how much more influence he gets at Bournemouth and what Bournemouth are able to do as well, of course. But no, just coming back to your question, because I've sort of talked around it there, there is certainly question marks about Parker's style of play and whether he is naturally conservative like he was as a player in his playing days, and whether he has been too safe. But, I think in the circumstances, considering where Fulham were in the Premier League, and then also the squad that he had in the Championship, I think there is still a case to say I'm personally not entirely sure that's a team. I mean, if he plays the same way, then it becomes very clear.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you mentioned about him wanting to play on the front foot, but then at times it morphed into a team that was very defensive. And it's almost like looking at AFC Bournemouth in the Premier League, Jeff, because we started off, first few seasons playing this amazing brand of football, but in the last season, it was completely different. And we did change our style. And the one thing that we struggled with and that's the same thing that a lot of Fulham fans are saying, are trying to actually break down teams that have got a low block. And that's one thing that they struggle with. That's one thing that we struggled with.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, Sam. And I think the way that he seeks to dominate teams is very similar to what Eddie used to preach. Dominate the ball and you will win games. But when we came up against those low block defences, we couldn't do it. And we struggled. I mean, there's so many games in that final season that spring to mind. The Palace away when they were down to 10 men and they just sat behind the ball. We couldn't even get behind them once, I don't think, in that entire game. So what do you think about that, Peter? Are they able, Parker teams, to break opposition defences down?
I have to say that Palace game is stained on my brain. That one, I won't forget that one in a hurry. But it's interesting. I think there is a difference between the way Parker's Fulham played, particularly in the Championship anyway, and the way Eddie Howe's Bournemouth played in those early years in the Premier League. I think Eddie Howe was far more handbrake off than Scott Parker. I think you could probably say that Scott Parker's teams are a bit more handbrake on. I think the possession football that they would play was a lot more safe, a lot more dominant, looking to try and build those openings and find those gaps. And then often it would be moments of brilliance, a little bit of skill and trickery that could be the difference, or picking out Mitrovic with a decent cross. I think it'd be interesting to see whether that's then replicated the same this coming season. I think I do agree about how Bournemouth's style did change. It became much more counter-attacking in that sense. In terms of breaking down low blocks, I think it was Fulham were quite mixed. There were games where it's hard to say it was a case of breaking teams down in that sense, where you're dominating the ball in the Premier League. I'm talking about here, and there are teams playing like that. I mean, Fulham were more often than not they were underdogs for every game, and it was about adapting to that and being able to cope with it. And then Where they did struggle and where they didn't necessarily pick up the points they needed to were in those games against the sides around them. I think to the 0-0s against Brighton, I think they went to West Brom and played really, really well and still managed to draw 2-2. They had a tendency to make mistakes at key times. But I think the big thing was that they always felt competitive. Up until that last run of games, they were always in games. It was never a game. I think they lost 3-0 to Manchester City, but even then, for most of the game, about 60% of it, with Fulham were in it. And there was a 15-minute spell where they conceded 3 goals. So that was the one quality that really shone through. And I think that goes back to what Parker's been saying in his interview since he's been appointed at Bournemouth about hard work being the basis for what he wants from his sides. And that's what you'll get. You'll get a side that will be battling in every game. Whether that means you'll be playing a front foot Eddie Howe style attacking play, I don't think so. I think it will be slightly different. But there will be that possession element, I think, in the Championship.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've seen a lot on Twitter and a lot of speculation about his relationships with certain people. How corrosive do you know of the relationship with the Fulham director of football to be?
I wouldn't say it was corrosive. I think by the end, it was the relationship between the ownership and Parker had clearly became quite sour. And I think by the time he left, and I think the nature of this whole period, I mean, it's dragged on for so long. And now the position Fulham are in, their players are back for pre-season and they don't have a head coach. For them, once the season was concluded, they wanted Scott Parker to lead them back into the Premier League. That was pretty clear. But all the time towards the end, Scott Parker would make the odd comment about what he was unhappy with at Fulham, and they included the structure of the hierarchy in terms of how they go about things, but fundamentally about squad turnover. So it was generally centered around recruitment, and of course that is Tony Khan's sort of domain. And the fact that Fulham have been going up, promoted, relegated, it leaves some chronic instability. And I think what Scott Parker wanted was a chance to sort of build a team that can then get up and stay up, but with a bit more of a slow process. Yeah. And I think that's what's really appealed about Bournemouth, is that that's really what he's been sold. I mean, that's what Neil Blake and Richard Hughes have been pitching to him, is this idea of his project, building it that way. And you'll probably get to see more of a team in Scott Parker's image, perhaps, than what he's been able to do at Fulham. That's not to say he hasn't been backed, and it's not to say his signings weren't that the signings were not of his influence. I look at Anthony Robinson and Tosin Adrabayo; they were both players that he'd really pushed for. So, I mean, in terms of the relationship, it wasn't great in the end, and I think that's been a common theme. I think Slavica Jokanovic also seemed to rub. It seemed to be quite tense when he was at Fulham too, from what I've heard. So, what will be interesting from a Fulham perspective is, with their next appointment, will they bring someone in who is able to work under this structure? Will they make changes? They're looking to bring in a new role, a director of scouting, it's called, which may see, we don't know yet because we need to see who's come in, but that will see someone full-time on the ground looking after recruitment, because Tony Khan is based in the United States. He has other interests, including in the NFL and also a wrestling operation as well. So it's a very different thing. There's a lot of things to manage, and I think in general, Scott Parker did speak well, but there were times where he would rebuke Tony Khan. There was a game against Aston Villa when things were tough at the start of the season. There was a lot of calls for new signings to come in that they weren't coming in. And in fairness to Fulham, I mean, in a pandemic, in the situation they were in, and the tight turnaround, it was really very difficult. And they recruited extremely well last year. All the loanees made a fantastic impact, particularly in defence. And when you look at the squad, they probably should have stayed in the top flight. So that's probably that's very much a block, perhaps on Parker's copybook, as it is on the delayed recruitment. That said, there were all these other factors, delayed time, whatever. But yeah, so by that point, I think after this game, Tony Khan, he doesn't tweet at all at the moment. He's gone into some kind of exile. But before, he tweeted, and then before Parker left the pitch, and that became a little bit. Parker then said, "Oh, shouldn't be apologising for performance before." He doesn't need to apologise for performance. If anyone's going to do that, it'd be me. So there were those sort of moments. I wouldn't say it was corrosive, but it just, by the end of the season, particularly with the way this is panning out, I mean, Bournemouth's interest is so long-standing, as has been reported, and as we've reported as well. It just kind of felt like, well, he doesn't want to be here. So naturally, that's how it's going to end.
And it's a really big statement, Pete, that a young, bright manager tipped for great things comes down to Bournemouth. with his entire coaching team. What can you tell us about the people around Parker? Because we've read quite a lot about him and his style, but what about the coaches and the fitness team that he's bringing with him?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, his coaching team are really important. They've been integral to what he's done at Fulham, and they've been with him for most of his time as a coach. So his assistant Matt Wells, goalkeeper coach Rob Birch, and first team analyst Jonathan Hill, they've all come with him to Bournemouth. He first sort of built up a bond with them during his time at Tottenham Hotspur, where he was under 18s coach. So Matt Wells was his assistant there, and he was learning under John McDermott. John McDermott is now at the FA, used to be the head of the academy at Tottenham. It was McDermott who sort of pushed Parker into that coaching pathway, and he had a huge influence on the way he plays, and also the way his team plays, and also how he's gone into coaching, got his badges early, got his badges while he's still a player. So that's where the bond comes in. Matt Wells is known to be a very intelligent guy, very studious. And then you've got also going with them is Charlie Moore. He joined Fulham in October 2020, also from Tottenham. Nathan Gardner also joined Fulham from Spurs at the same time. I think he's stayed at Fulham as far as I'm aware. And then there's also Alistair Harris. So Alistair Harris was head of performance at Fulham. He'd been at Fulham for 11 years. So that was quite a long time, and it was quite a surprise to see him go. But Alistair Harris, Jonathan Hill, Matt Wells, Rob Birch, and Scott Parker formed a really tight unit. They're with each other all the time. You know, I did a piece on the group of them on The Athletic about them specifically and their tight bond. And you know, people say they spend more time with each other than with their families. So I think it was very important that Parker took his team with him, and it's no surprise to see that. And of course, that has meant change at Bournemouth, of course, which is almost a major changing of the guard, really, with seeing the likes of Neil Moss and Stephen Purchase and Steve Hard depart, which is a big change, but also a sign that I think Bournemouth are very much invested in Parker and that project.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. So there are a lot of comparisons that we see between Eddie and Scott. Can you tell us where you think they're maybe a little bit different?
Ooh. I think
all the same as well. All the same. We'll just reaffirm those, because some people are saying that they're like very studious. They like to play football the same ways, and we've seen a lot of parallels between the styles on the pitch. But I just wonder where they may also be a little bit different.
I think the biggest difference will be stylistically. I think you may see that, unless we see a different version of Scott Parker's football, which I think is very possible. He likes to play possession-based football. He likes to have a spare man all the time in possession. He likes his team to dominate games, make it difficult for opponents, and then also keep it very, very tight. You do get that sort of defensive midfielder element of what he was as a player, I think, in his management.
Yeah.
I think they're both, Eddie Howe and Scott Parker, are young managers. They've both got their best years ahead of him. I think Eddie was much more experienced in terms of the challenges he'd had to face, and I think it will be interesting to see how he sort of works within the Bournemouth structure. I think it'll be interesting to see how he will sort of approach it. They're very similar in terms of where they want to be, and that's on a training field. They're not the type of people who want to be managing. Now, Eddie Howe, of course, was manager in every sense of the word, wasn't he? It was all over every department at Bournemouth. It was his kingdom. But I think most people would say that Eddie Howe was most at home when he was coaching players on the field. And I think Scott Parker's the same in that mould. And I think from a Bournemouth perspective, they were looking for someone to sort of take on that mantle, to be a coach, who will work with young players individually and try and improve them. We've seen that, I think, at Fulham in terms of the loanees that came in and the players that were recruited, particularly in the Premier League. The likes of Tosin Adebayo, Anthony Robinson, Kenny Tettis come in and did very well. Loanees like Ola Aina, Ademola Lookman. There's not a given that these players would perform in the Premier League. None of them had Premier League experience before, really. I mean, apart from Ruben Loftus-Cheek, I think he's got about 100 Premier League appearances. The rest of them, aren't that experienced, and you wouldn't even say that Loftus-Cheek is the most experienced at that level, considering how interrupted his career has been so far. So there is definitely an element of taking an individual player and improving them, and I think that's something that really does appeal to Bournemouth, and that's probably why they've seen him as sort of a Howe successor.
And What about the title he's got, head coach? I mean, how different is being a head coach to being called a manager, and do people worry about that?
I don't think Scott Parker will worry about it. I think as much as there was, I wouldn't say it was like, as we talked about before, it wasn't like a great unrest between, the hierarchy and the club structure at Fulham and Parker. I mean, there was clearly tension, but he was happy to be a head coach. He was happy to be the coach and just focus on the day-to-day with his players. Now, of course, you want, as a head coach, you want to have strong influence in recruitment because you want players that will fit the way you want to play. And there is a massive difference with being a manager, because manager gives you much more influence over all areas of the club, and that includes down to the academy side and everything else that comes with that. So I don't think that won't be an issue, particularly for Parker. And I think what's interesting for Bournemouth, of course, is that this was clearly something that they wanted to go down post Eddie Howe, and the fact that he is that title of head coach sort of underlines that difference, where Bournemouth have moved away from having the manager who sees everything, does everything, a la Sir Alex Ferguson or an Arsene Wenger, that kind of thing, to someone who is a head coach and his responsibilities are in the coaching department. All of that said, of course, one of the big appeals about Bournemouth was the influence he may have in recruitment. So, and actually cultivating that project. So that will be interesting to see. But in terms of the differences between a manager and a head coach, they are very, very different. But to be honest, I think when you look around the game today and you look around, especially European football, I think in English football, we're still not quite got a head round. We've not quite got our head rounds it. Goodness me, we've not quite got our head around it.
Yeah.
Not just in the sense of not understanding it, but actually implementing it. There are a lot of clubs with a director of football, with head coaches, and yet they don't seem to operate in an effective way whereby a director of football can set the style of play and operate like that. I don't quite get the impression that's what Bournemouth have got. Obviously, Richard Hughes is technical director. But I don't think that's exactly the sort of structure and style. But all the same, it's that title does indicate a sort of shift.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, with the chasm that was left after Eddie Howe departed the club, to me, using the head coach badge, it almost feels like a superficial move to sort of look as though they're better prepared for the future by devolving responsibility a bit and almost leaving the door sort of further ajar for change if they need it. But does it perhaps make the board a bit more culpable if they are the ones, well, not the board, but those higher up? Does it make them a bit more culpable? Because if they're the ones effectively who are, deciding the transfers or have got more input than, probably ever before, does that make them more culpable?
Potentially. I think with Bournemouth, it's unique in the sense that for so long, it's been so stable. Under Eddie Howe, everything would go through Eddie. And I think the board were fortunate in that sense that they were never really front and center, because the good times were ongoing, almost never ending really until relegation. And when you don't have the questions asked of you, it gets a sense of, well, are they guilty? Are they culpable for what goes wrong? And I think that's always been the case. I don't think that changes necessarily with a change in how they structure things at the club. I don't think the structure has changed enormously, other than quite clearly that the head coach will now take more of a head coach role, and that will allow Neil Blake and Richard Hughes to stay at the forefront of running the operational side of the club and recruitment too.
It feels, Peter, it's been a long-term love affair, this, and finally, we've got our man. What's the connection between Parker and the club? And in his interview with the AFCB, he talked about watching us numerous times in the past. Obviously, there's the connection with Harry Arter, but is there something that we're missing? Why is he so attracted to come to Bournemouth?
I don't think you're missing anything. I think that was the thing that came back when the talk about Scott Parker potentially going to Bournemouth first appeared. It was the link through Harry Arter and the fact that he'd been there at the club watching games quite a lot. He was familiar with it. It's not particularly far from him. I think he was based in Surrey. So there was that sort of awareness of the club and understanding. But where I think that bond has been built has been in Bournemouth's long-standing interest in him. It does go back. I mean, the first time I heard Scott Parker mentioned was I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but it was when Eddie Howe left, he was one of the names that were mentioned. You think, oh, okay, that's unusual, because Fulham were about to get promoted to the Premier League or potentially via the playoffs. So, and they've talked about it. The club put it out themselves that they were looking at him during his time at Tottenham. So there's always been this awareness of Scott Parker as a promising young coach and someone that they would want to take and potentially see as a fit to replace Eddie Howe. So I think where that bond has improved has been in that process of quite clear they have an interest in me. They're invested in what I want to do. He already had the background through Harry Arter and knowing the club quite well in that sense. And then that relationship is built separately from there, really. And then that made the offer, I think, really appealing. And this is the thing. I mean, it's one of the things I think from a Fulham side, it's what kind of move is this for Scott Parker? What is the appeal of Bournemouth, really? Because as you say, I mean, there's more to it. There has to be more to it than just
it's got to be
from a footballing side, because Fulham are extremely well placed to get promoted next year, both in terms of how the championship's looking, parachute payments, the squad they've got. It seems kind of strange, really, almost to go to Bournemouth, who, having missed out last year, are probably going to fight to try and keep Danjuma and David Brooks and Jefferson Lerma. These are key players. So it's not going to be an easy challenge by any means for Scott Parker. And that's where it's been very interesting. And as you say, that sort of appeal, that sense of we want you to be our man to lead the project, I think is what has taken him from Craven Cottage. You
mentioned Danjuma, Brooks there, Lerma. I mean, there are players that many AFC Bournemouth fans would love to be keeping that we probably won't be keeping. I mean, in Scott Parker's mould as a manager and as a player, are there certain players do you think he'd be desperate to keep hold of, or even certain players within the current squad that they are Scott Parker players?
I think if he could keep hold of the likes of Danjuma and Brooks and Lerma, I think he'd love to. But the question of whether that happens is a different story, really. I think there's a financial side to it, of course, but then also these are players who will see themselves at a higher level than in the Premier League. I think there are players in that squad that will really take to Parker. I think Lerma would be a good player. I think one Fulham player who really has excelled under his watch is Harrison Reed, who played in the same position as Scott Parker. I spoke to him in an interview last month, actually, and he spoke really well about how Parker was able to teach him on a relatable level about fitting into the way he wants to play, the importance of the holding midfield position. So that would be one area. I think defensively, in particular, I think defenders, because of how solid Fulham were, they will absolutely be. They will benefit from Parker coming in and improving in that sense. So, Parker, I think one of the things he prides the most is about knowing his players. When he came into Fulham, he did a background check. He got an exterior company to come in and assess them psychologically to try and work out what type of personalities they were. Are these players that we can, that he can put his arm around? Are these players that he can speak to? And man management is massive for him, absolutely key. And you can sort of get the sense of that. You could see that as a player in the way he would sort of lead. He was always a leader, always captain. And that comes across in his management. And that will be a really big thing. And that's probably why he has such an impact on young coachable players too, because if they buy into what he wants to do, then they will get some positive outcomes.
Should Fulham fans be concerned about any Fulham players coming down with Parker to join us?
I don't think so, actually. I think one of the issues Parker had is because of the way the recruitment was last season. A lot of them were loan players, and a lot of those loan players who probably benefited the most from Parker as manager have now left. They've gone back to their parent clubs, none of whom are staying. I mean, there's every chance that some of those loanees, I mean, if Bournemouth are able to lure them, then potentially that they could be options. But in terms of the core of the squad at Fulham, I think a sizable amount of the squad didn't feature as much, I think, as they would have liked. There were some players who were very unhappy at the way they'd been sidelined by Parker. So I don't get the feeling that many will be in a rush to follow him. But we'll see. We'll see. The thing is with Parker in the Championship, there was a strong bond that came after what was a very difficult relegation. I think much more difficult, perhaps, within the club than the one just gone in 2018-19. I'm talking about where they cycled through Stavisy Jokanovic, Claudio Ranieri, two wildly contrasting styles, and then Parker sort of picked up the pieces a little bit. So there is that connection there, but I think looking at the way Fulham's squad was made up, I think the loanies have either left, and some of those key players, the likes of Andre Frank, Zambo and Gisa, Alexander Mitrovic's future is uncertain. He did not get on particularly well by Scott Parker. We can interpret from his lack of game time. I don't get the sense that there'll be too many that follow him to Vitality.
Interesting. Jeff, we know what Eddie used to do, and Fletch and a number of others. They used to take him around the town. They used to sell the club, didn't they, to the players that they were trying to attract. And Eddie, I wouldn't say he had lots of charisma, but he had a sort of understated charisma, and he was known for his diligence, and he sold a plan to the players that were joining as well. Scott Parker, though, does he strike you as someone that's got that?
I'm not sure, if I'm honest. I watched that interview, and a lot of the ways that he talks reminds me of Eddie. But I wonder, and we were being talked about with Patrick Vieira, obviously, and I can see if I'm a player and Patrick Vieira's the coach, yeah, I want to play for him because of everything he achieved. Scott Parker, not so sure. Then again, Eddie Howe, he was relatively unknown, but it was that force of personality and what he did that made him so persuasive, I think. Don't know. What do you think, Peter? Where does Scott Parker stand in the charisma stakes?
Oh, charisma. He's a really, really nice guy, really approachable guy, very good at communicating with people. And I do think that is actually one of his strengths, will be appealing to prospective new signings. I know when Eddie Howe was at Bournemouth, he was such a draw for players. Everyone would mention Eddie Howe when they were signing. But to be honest, it was quite similar with Scott Parker and his interventions. Whenever they were looking to sign players, they generally would. The feedback would be they wanted to play for Scott Parker. They liked what they'd heard about Scott Parker. They liked what they heard about his training. His training at Fulham, and I think that really did appeal to signings, and it was important because Fulham had to get the right players in. And I mentioned Tosin Adrabayo and Anthony Robinson. Those were players that he really pushed for, and was persuasive in encouraging to sign. I mean, Anthony Robinson was all set for Sheffield United before Fulham swooped at the last minute and scooped him up. So I do actually think that will be one thing. I think in terms of his reputation, I think he does command a lot of respect for his playing career and the clubs he's played for. Obviously, he's played for England as well. His standing in the game is really very good, and it's one of the things I think. I think one of the things about Parker is everyone seems to think he gets an easy ride in the media, and that dates back to his time as a player when he won Football Writers' Player of the Year despite West Ham getting relegated. And he comes across very well, and you'll see that in his media in the same way that Eddie Howe did. He came across really, really well. He's really, really nice and really, really helpful as well. So that side will come across, but it's the sort of positive press, if you see what I mean, doesn't necessarily just come from how Parker is in conversation. I mean, all my meetings with Scott Parker have been over Zoom. It's been one of the most bizarre seasons ever from a journalistic perspective, but it's from those you speak to elsewhere and around the game. There's a real sense that Fulham have lost a good manager, I think, in football circles. So that bodes well, and that speaks to the way he's sort of perceived among stakeholders as well.
It's quite interesting because Eddie Howe, I think, had a very good reputation in the game. He was very friendly with many other managers, and it sounds like he could pick up the phone and almost speak to anyone. And Scott Parker sounds of a similar ilk, where he's got relationships with other footballing people. I know that Eddie Howe had a relatively close footballing relationship with Brendan Rodgers, etc. One of the things that Eddie Howe was I wouldn't say criticised for, but one of the things that fans thought he perhaps couldn't do, one of his weaknesses, was manage egos. Jermaine Defoe, when he came down the second time, his spell wasn't particularly great. Fallouts apparently with Asmir Begovic, Sylvain Distin, Lee Tomlin. We can reel off a number of names that didn't quite perform. What about Scott Parker? What's he like with egos? Has he got maybe better management of that?
That's an interesting one. I think there may be a similarity there. I mean, the one interesting player, of course, is Alexander Mitrovic. The fact that it wasn't able to work in the Premier League. Now, Fulham did try to change a different style of play. There was quite clearly a sense that he's not suited to what they wanted to do. However, it was pretty clear that, Mitrovic wasn't, it's difficult, but I wouldn't say he got the best opportunity in the top flight. He never really got a consistent run of games after what was a very difficult period at the start. He missed a penalty for Serbia, which prevented them from qualifying for the European Championships. He also missed a penalty for Fulham. And he really struggled for form. But then he came back in and he had a couple of good games and then dropped out again. And it never seemed like the relationship was particularly warm between the pair of them last season. So he, of course, is a big character in the dressing room. And so it'll be interesting in that sense to see how he deals with those at Bournemouth. I don't think there are too many big egos at the club now. But what was interesting, I think, about Jonathan Woodgate was how players really did sort of take to him. I think that was one of his real strengths, was that side of him. And I think what bodes well for Parker is his man management, his emphasis on that. It's a real test of him to see if he can do it. He's shown he can be ruthless by moving players out of the picture who he doesn't think will be involved. So in that sense, the groundwork's there, but I don't think we know really enough about him, to be honest, to make a fair judgment, because he's only, this is only his second job as a full-time head coach. He's had two years at Fulham, really, 2 full seasons. So it's one of those questions that will have to be answered going forward, I think.
One of the other criticisms from last season was that we had not so much a team, but a group of individuals who take to the pitch. And Parker has been talking a lot about hard work and a team ethic. Do you think he'll have success in figuring out how to create a team out of talented individuals?
I think so. And I think what bodes well on that front is just how well he was able to mould together Fulham's loanees. It's not easy to work with players who aren't necessarily contracted to the club, players who don't therefore necessarily have the same, you would presume anyway from the outside, would not have the same buy-in. But that never seemed to be the case. I mean, one of the most striking images from last season was Mario Lemina leaving the pitch in floods of tears after Fulham lost to Wolves really late on. There was no questioning the commitment of those players, the passion that they showed. The likes of Joachim Andersen, who's now in the Denmark national team at the Euros, he was really passionate. He was given the captain's armband after 4 games by Parker, and he was able to bring together what was a new group, really, another new squad, a new starting 11, and get them playing cohesively together. And as I was saying earlier, that team was competitive, and that's a really difficult thing to do. There were games where you'd have only 1 or 2 players starting who had been involved in the Championship the previous season. Yeah. So that bodes well in terms of bringing players together. And I think what Parker will want to emphasise is that, it's always the team first, and there will be a sense that if you don't want to be there, then you probably won't be involved. But I think in that sense, yeah, there is evidence to show that I think he can bring a group together in that sense. Yeah, definitely.
I think judging by the nature of the fact that he has left them, for us, he's going to be driven to do better than them this season. And Fulham are a team that I'm almost certain are going to be in amongst it. So if Bournemouth are as well, that can only be a good thing. But do you, knowing the clubs as you do, what do you think will suit him at Bournemouth compared to Fulham?
Definitely the structure. I think that's the sort of influence and to mould the squad in his own light. I actually think the squad at Bournemouth may suit him. I think there's a lot of young players in that team who could be coached or at least fit that sort of mould. And I think Fulham are sort of moving to that, but Fulham have got an older squad. A lot of players who've been there and done it. I think 13 players at Fulham are now 28 and over. So that gives you a real sense of just how sort of different those squads are. Bournemouth got younger during the Premier League years, and then now I think one of its big weaknesses is a lack of experience. So I think Parker will see that and want to address that on the one hand, but then at the same time, working with those young players and improving them. Those are the players that did quite well under him last season. So for sure, yeah, I think in that regard, yeah, then that bodes well.
Scott Parker, to me, I sense he's like one of the old school footballers. So do you think that he'll be happier with a director of football or, whatever Richard Hughes is with his title than someone that has got half an interest in wrestling. Surely he just wants a football man because he's old school and he just wants to play and, coach football rather than be kind of concerned that his man above him has got his mind elsewhere.
I think the one thing Parker would say, and I think he said it after, I think Tony Khan had a Twitter conversation with the Peterborough chairman, where he talked about, we were interested in Tony, but couldn't do it because of financial fair play. Parker would always go back to this line about wanting to build a world-class organisation. He wants the club to be world-class in everything it does. And I think that just comes down to a baseline of professionalism. And that's something that's really big for him. And I think you can see that from the way he dresses. That's the minimum expectation. And that applies in all areas. And he wants the club to be seen in that way. He wants everything they do and how they act to be in that manner. And I think the way Bournemouth do act, especially my experience during the time in the Premier League, of course, Bournemouth's a small club. Of course, it's not got the big following that some other teams do at the high level, but they really did conduct themselves as a top flight club professionally and in an effective way. So that's something that he will enjoy, and I think he will also encourage a buy-in. That's not to say that wasn't the case at Fulham. There are fantastic structures at Fulham, particularly when you look at their academy, and then at the top level as well. So, but what I do think that will be something that he will want to press, and I think he'll be able to do that more at Bournemouth.
Okay, I'm inclined to just ask, how do you think he's going to start? West Brom at home, first game. It's a big one, and it could be a promotion-defining game to start the season with.
Yeah, big game to start the season with, and obviously West Brom have managed to appoint Valérien Ismaël, who I think is a really good coach, and I wouldn't have gone amiss at Fulham, really. So, a really, really tough game. I think what bodes well is the fact that he's come in now. You've got him from the first day of pre-season. That's really, really important. I think Fulham would love to have someone in by the end of the week, hopefully. But yeah, and I think the fact that there is that time for him to work with the players, by the time the team do take to the field against West Brom, you'll have an idea. You should have an idea of what Scott Parker team will look like. You will have had that time to have worked with them. So Bournemouth will need to hit the ground running. It'd be interesting to see how they do. I do think the clubs that have come down are very well equipped to go back up. Sheffield United, of course, have appointed another former Fulham manager in Slavisa Jokanovic, who did fantastically well at Craven Cottage, is still really well liked here. And that means that, there's a real competitiveness at the top end. And, from Fulham's perspective, they need to get someone in that can compete with that. And because it seems like those clubs and Bournemouth are set now to really compete at the top end of the table.
Should be interesting. Jeff, any more?
I mean, we're all crystal ball gazing, Pete, but what do you think chances are of us going up next season?
I think it's really dependent on who you keep and who you sign. I know that's obviously a given for every team in football, but I feel it's really, really important for Bournemouth and just where they are now in relation to the direction do they want to go. Do they want to reset and go, okay, it may not happen this year, but we've got a manager now we can build around, and then we can build some of our young players up and then go that way? Or do you roll the dice again? And how much are you able to roll the dice again? Without the income streams that have been lost, with the pandemic influence and things like that. Yeah, you would assume with a new manager he will be backed. So we'll have to see on that front. But keep if players like David Brooks or Arnaud Danjuma, if they're kept or or at least replaced, then yeah, absolutely they'll be competing. But I think from how I see it at the moment, I would see Bournemouth as very strong playoff contenders. Yeah. And I think, that's not to say they won't be, but I think it does depend on recruitment. Again, if that recruitment is right, and I think if the squad as it is now, before anyone leaves, that's an automatic promotion play squad. There's no doubt about that. But I don't think the squad will look like that necessarily come the start of the season.
Quick word for Fletcher, we just saw on our screen, Jeff. Of course, he's been in and around Perchie, Neil Moss, Simon Weatherston, Fraser. I mean, Neil Moss especially, playing together for so long, and Purchase. It must be very difficult for people like him and people that are in and around those kind of roles, to see some work colleagues, but also friends leaving the club after so long. It's very different for AFC Bournemouth for that to happen, isn't it?
It totally is. We've been built as a club in Eddie's image, with a lot of the players that Eddie grew up with and played with and knew so well being brought into the coaching team. A lot of that structure was Eddie's, and it feels like it's being dismantled, and maybe the time is right to just change things around. But Fletch is crikey, he's a member of staff who's got a stand named after him. You know, where is that in the football structure? I don't see that anywhere else, really. And I think he still embodies that culture that all the fans buy into. How that pans out, how it works, it's going to be dependent on success on the pitch. You know, if Parker can start well, build a good relationship with the fans, if we can feel that togetherness that we used to have under Eddie, that'd be great.
I think one of the things we discussed, I think, when Eddie Howe left last year, was just about what Bournemouth were going to do. That's a Freudian slip. Fulham and Bournemouth interchangeable there. But just in terms of whether Bournemouth would cut ties and go, right, we need to reset now. Eddie Howe's gone, that era is changed, or do we, stick rather than twist? And I think in the circumstances, in the pandemic, it did make sense for Max Denman to go, do you know what, Jason Tindall, I think you can do it. Let's see. It's worked for before. We've had 1 bad year. But I think now, having had the season that Bournemouth have had, not quite, underperforming really for the squad that Bournemouth have, looking at it and going, right, we do have to change. We do have to turn the page here. This may mean some really difficult decisions for people who are, really good close friends. And I think that makes it all the more difficult. Yeah. I'm sure they'll look to join Eddie Howe wherever he ultimately lands, whenever that may be. But I think it makes sense now to go, right, that era is past. Now we move forward. But at the same time, keeping Fletcher on board is important, because you don't want to lose touch with what you've built, because the moment you start doing that, the moment you sort of go away from what had brought so much success and so many happy memories, and trying to keep something of that alive is also really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So plan for you next season then, Peter?
Yeah, covering Fulham next year. So I'll be back down at the Vitality Stadium. I think are we early or are we later?
There's one in December. I can't remember.
There's one with 3 games to go as well. I saw that. That could be very,
right.
very big. Yeah. But no, yeah, staying with Fulham. So I'll be seeing you guys a little bit more, and of course I'll be keeping a close eye, because not just because of the Bournemouth links, but also now you've got a manager that I've covered for each season as well. So the ties keep intertwining.
Brilliant. Well, appreciate your time today, Peter. Thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
No problem at all.
And also Jeff Hayward, thank you very much, and no doubt we'll be catching up very soon.
Well, looking forward to some more away days at Fulham. 5 goals, 3 goals. There have been some lovely, lovely games there, haven't there?
There have. Can't wait to get started. And as you've seen, they are on the training ground already. So, should be interesting to see what happens over the next month or so, see who's coming and who's going, etc. Fulham fans, they, some are happy to see him go. Bournemouth fans, most of which are happy to see Scott arriving. One thing we can all be unified on is we all hope England beat Germany tonight, eh? Until then, until the next video, up the cherries.